Let's have a little discussion, a little theory about terrains and overlays. So, what are terrains? What are overlays? What are height maps? What's all this stuff we're about to do as part of this LiDAR to terrain free process? So, let's talk about terrains and height maps. In of itself, terrains ultimately are the dirt of our course, the hills, the flat areas, the rolling areas, the cliffs. It's how the elevation is on our course, and it's really the base. We need something like that to get started on, something to put our fairways on, something to put our tee boxes on. So that is really our terrain. When we do terrains and we generate these terrains as far as this LiDAR to terrain, this overlay process, you're going to generate two terrains. You're going to have an inner and you're going to have an outer. Your inner, you have to have an inner. You're not going to get away without an inner because your course will sit on the inner terrain and it is the smaller of the two. And terrains are always perfect squares. They have to be a perfect square because Unity requires a terrain to be perfectly square. So we want that inner terrain to barely encompass your course, right? The 18 holes of your course, we want it to barely encompass that because it is very high resolution. The better the resolution that we can get, because think about when you're putting on a green, if we can get down to the inch on how that slopes, that's better. Okay, and so we want higher resolution, which makes the file size as far as its size of the file, it makes it much bigger if we have higher resolution. So we want to make that inner terrain really kind of small as possible so it barely fits around our course. Now your course might not be square in an area, it might be long, but we still have to make that terrain square and fit our course as best possible. Now, on the other hand, we also have an outer terrain. And an outer terrain, the largest we really do is 5 kilometers wide. There's restrictions in game and Unity on why it's 5 kilometers, but it's optional. You don't need an outer terrain. It's purely for aesthetics and appearances. Like I built a lot of courses in Pennsylvania where there's some rolling hills outside of my golf courses. So if I build an outer terrain, I now have those hills. So when I look out across my golf course, I see the immediate trees, but in the background, I see the hills, and it makes it very accurate and realistic to have the exact mountains and hills on that outer terrain. It's really just for aesthetics and appearances, and it's lower resolution. That way, the course, that file, the height map associated with it, we'll talk about height maps, isn't as big and it's not as granular because we don't need it to be because it's just way off there in the distance. But the outer is optional. I would say generate it, and if you decide to use it, great, and if not, no big deal. Now let's talk about there's a granular difference between what a terrain is versus a height map, okay? A height map is ultimately the data file associated with a terrain. So at the end of the LiDAR to terrain free process, you'll come out with a height map file, which is then brought into Unity, and then Unity uses that height map to create a object called a terrain. And that terrain is tied to that height map. Okay, so a terrain is based on a height map, and a height map is just the data. Okay, so the other thing that you're going to be doing as part of this process, this LiDAR to terrain free process, is creating overlays. And an overlay is nothing more than a satellite picture of your course. And you use it in a couple different things. One is when we get to Inkscape, you're going to use that overlay image to trace out and build your splines. And your splines are how you identify a green, how you identify a semi-rough, a fairway, a rough, maybe a wooded area, tee boxes. But you need like an image to kind of show you where this stuff is at, and that's where these overlays come into play. They're also used in Unity, so it kind of acts as, so when we have that terrain that we just talked about, well, that terrain is just elevation. What we do is we lay an overlay on top of that and essentially kind of paint your terrain so you can see, well, this is where my tee box is and this is where my fairway is. Otherwise, it's just like this white plain elevation, which we don't want. And it can also be used in Unity as a sanity check to make sure that your meshes that you do in Inkscape match up to what you're going to be doing in Unity. This will make sense as you go through the process. We are going to create, as part of this process, you're going to create 4 overlays. Remember we talked about the inner and outer terrains? Well, yeah, so you're going to have an overlay for your inner and you're going to have overlays for your outer. And there's 2 big companies that make these. It's Microsoft Bing, and Google. So the reason that we get the Bing overlays and the Google overlays for your inner and your outer is because sometimes, depending on the time of year the imagery was created, it might be winter, which doesn't do you really well. Maybe it's deep in summer and there's so many trees you can't see. So maybe one of those is better than the other. So we're going to create four. And if one of them isn't available or is really crappy, no big deal. If both of them are crappy, you got a problem. There's ways that you can do historical imagery, more of an advanced topic, but you can do it. So it's not all is entirely lost. So you just need to look at that advanced topic. But I would suggest for your first course, you try to find a course that has a good, solid satellite overlay. So that's it for this theory, and on to the next video for you.